so delighted to have you. We're so delighted to have you, and we are recording this meeting. This is part of our virtual stage series, which was our biweekly coordination meeting, but we've refashioned this, as you know, over the last couple of months to really take advantage of this time to hear from different leaders across our global community around pandemic preparedness and response. So welcome to our virtual stage. And we are so delighted that today, and I'm personally delighted to welcome our friend, good friend, Loyce Pace, who, as you know, is currently Director of the Office of Global Affairs at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, but not so long ago was part of this community, and as President and CEO of the Global Health Council, and so many leadership roles that she's played. But we're delighted to have her in this role, carrying the torch for this and so many agendas around global health that we all care so deeply about. So we thought it would be very timely to have Loyce today for our fireside Zoom chat, because she is in so many of the critical conversations that are happening now, and very timely because, as you know, tomorrow there will be a foreign ministerial, which is part of the follow-up to the global COVID summit that happened in September, hosted by President Biden. And so we want to talk about that. We want to talk about what's happened since then. We want to talk about what's happening, that maybe we're not seeing behind the scenes, and but where are we? Where do we need to go? We're going to talk about what's coming up in a few weeks, which is the World Health Assembly special session, which is focused around a pandemic treaty or agreement. Talk about that and what the outlook might be for that, and generally get thoughts from Loyce about on many of these trends on and the issues we've been focused on through Pandemic Action Network about how do we get more speed on progress around the response, greater accountability, and also leverage this political moment for real traction on pandemic preparedness. So we have a lot to talk about. So we're going to dive in, and I'm going to ask Loyce a few questions for the first part of our hour, and then open it up to all of you. So please do think about what you'd like to ask Loyce, and we'll take full advantage of this time with her. So Loyce, welcome. Delighted to have you. Maybe just the place to kick off really is on the Global COVID Summit. It's been 7 weeks tomorrow, if I did my math correctly, which will, and as we know, Secretary Blinken is going to be hosting, I think it's something like 35 foreign ministers and several of the multilateral leaders tomorrow. So maybe just a little quick overview from you. Where are we? Where are we going? What's been the progress so far? Where do you see the gaps? And maybe a little bit on what we hope will come out of tomorrow.
Well, I will do my best. Hi, Carolyn. Thanks for having me. And hi, everyone. It's very strange to be a guest here and not a participant, but times change. In any case, I'm happy to be back among many people that I know. And as Carolyn said, used to be where you all are, and still consider myself somewhat where you all are, trying to push for the same thing. So I have to acknowledge all the great work that everyone on the screen has been doing. It's really been felt even from here. So kudos to you for keeping us honest. So tomorrow, yes, Secretary Blinken is going to be convening folks to have a conversation about how to do what, Caroline, I know you talked about publicly, right? Sustain momentum and ensure that we are truly making a difference and having an impact. We can point to, I think the US in particular has continuously taken stock and can still point to some things that we've been able to do, and I think that we can be proud of, right? So whether it's sharing now, over 200 million vaccines in 100 countries, or otherwise supporting the scale up of those products in countries, whether it's doing things like hosting the summit, and even sort of putting our own skin in the game, not just when it comes to the response, but preparedness or other areas like we'll get into with WHO. There's still miles to go, right? And so tomorrow is a lot about having more of a deep dive conversation and at a political level, recognizing that that momentum really needs to be sustained up top. There have been plenty of, obviously, health practitioners and professionals, including health ministries or ministers, who have been ringing this bell for years, honestly, let alone the past 2 years. And, you know, finance ministers, heads of state, they all get it. But frankly, we probably need more of them on record, right? And really being clear about what their commitments are in this space, and how they will support the very real needs of the public health community given this global health crisis. So that's the general overlay. I think what we'll find, hopefully, is that there is clear agreement still, obviously, on sort of where we're going, but more explicitly, sort of the gap between here and there. Surely there will be a discussion on some accountability framework, so that we can truly measure our success or failure, or hopefully more of the former. And then some not just clarity around commitments, but, you know, coming back to what folks have committed and why or how there's still a delta, right? So whether we're looking at the G7 commitments on vaccines, or we're looking at, you know, the call for a financial intermediary fund that the VP put forth, and funds that go there, just I think really trying to, I don't want to say pin folks down, but just be even more clear about and go around the table with regards to, you know, what each country or government can contribute, or any outstanding questions they might have about what's required. The last thing I'll say is, I think it's important not only to see this as a donor discussion, for lack of a better term, but you know, there should be and will likely be other countries and governments represented. And so what does it look or feel like to ensure that they have a voice in this space and understand and just have the room to speak to their commitments as well, not just their needs, if that makes sense. So, you know, less of a top-down conversation and more of a conversation about sort of a collective response and commitment.
Thanks for that. There's a lot to unpack there. Maybe just a little bit to follow up on a couple of things you said. Look, we're all for pinning folks down. We think there hasn't been enough of that, right? So we hope that, you know, the U.S. is going to use every tool at its disposal. But as you said, it also can't. This is about everybody actually doing their part. I like the going around the table, who's going to do what. We haven't seen enough of that. So, and that's what we've been calling for consistently as a community. So we will wait anxiously what comes out of that meeting. But I mean, you know, as you know, there's been just real frustration in the sense that, like, you know, leading up to the summit, things had, then we had the summit and we had this moment that was a bit of a reset, but now momentum is flagging again. We are already seeing that we're far behind reaching the target for 40% vaccination around the world by the end of the year, but it's not impossible. No. It's not impossible, but yet it's almost like the world has given up on that. And so any thoughts just about, like, you know, so where else is the, at least from the US perspective, but where else can we actually take some steps that will close that gap as much as possible? If not, why aren't we? I mean, let's try to reach that 40%. And so thoughts also about where you know, the US is leaning in to push, you know, it's put its own commitments on the table, but is leaning in on others to do that, you know, there's everything from dose donations to dose, you know, Q swapping, getting COVAX in the lead, but also about, you know, just really putting the full, you know, the full weight of the world, as it will, across sectors into the delivery challenge.
Yeah, that's been the hardest part for me, is this sense that the fact that anyone would say that what we're uh, aiming for feels too ambitious is very hard to hear. This we I don't care if it's impossible. It's necessary, right? We don't actually have a choice but to do the impossible, or at least pursue the impossible. So that's I will say that that is something that I feel personally. I will not try to summarize the US's stance on that as an administration. But ideally, the targets we put forward at the summit speak for themselves, right? And so that's why, going into tomorrow, there will absolutely be a review of those targets to remind everyone of our level of ambition, right? And our commitment to that level of ambition. And I wonder if it's also important to just step back and also clarify what led to that level of ambition, right? Like, what are our operating principles or core values that are driving these numbers? It's not just about 40% and 70%, right? This is about access and lives and
About people.
equity. Yeah. God forbid we talk about actual people in all of this. So that's, yeah, that's, let's be there and stay there as much as possible. And on that note, I mean, look, I'll come back to the vaccine commitment, since that, is what's driving this 40% number. And this idea or call for transparency. So both countries and companies that have made these commitments really do need to be forthcoming when it comes to what they've shared or what's in their supply. There's just no other way to say it. We have not had that level of clarity or visibility into what we're all doing. The US has its site that we put out there publicly, where you can see how we're tracking on our commitments toward, the 1.1 billion we're planning to share over the next, I guess now, 10 months. And I would like to think that's something other countries could do, let alone industry, right? To demonstrate what they've said they have even at their disposal, let alone what they said that they would offer others. And this is important not just for vaccines or vaccinations, but also for everything else we have to get done, right? Like, even in when we consider vaccines, recognizing that there also should be more clarity as to what shots are getting into arms, right? So we took a similar approach here at home. And, not to mention all of the other pieces to this puzzle. So until people have access to vaccines, what about treatments? What about tests? I mean, this is just, we need this across the board. And it's one of the reasons why we called for that in the summit too.
Yeah, and I mean, I can't say it enough that I think what really was important from our view was that this unified storyline on vaccination, on saving lives, but also on the future, and stitching that together. And so I know the intention is to keep that frame, but it feels like there's constantly an effort to want to pull that apart. Let's just focus on this. Let's just focus on this. Let's think about preparedness far into the future. No, so like, if there's one message I think, we want to convey, it's to keep threading all of that together, that we have to, and we should be able to do all of these things to walk and chew gum at the same time. This is a global crisis. Yeah. Well, I know there's going to be lots more questions, probably wanting to drill down on the response. So I'll let folks come in on that in a little bit, but maybe just to look ahead then in a few weeks. So we'll see what comes out of the ministerial. That is focused on the current crisis largely, but also planning for the future. But the WHA special session is really about how are we going to really change the whole way that we deal with these crises. And what's on the table, of course, is whether there will be an agreement to start a process on negotiations around a treaty or a framework agreement. So,
Right.
there's been lots of discussion about whether the US supports this, doesn't support it, how's it showing up. Europe is saying we want all in, and we've got to change the rules of the road and go all for this. And then, not just the US, but other countries have been saying, well, let's see. But we also think that maybe like folks aren't so far apart as it might pretend to be in terms of what we want. So what's your take on going into this and what you hope where you hope we can land, at least to see something meaningful come out of the special session?
Yeah, I like where you landed there. I wonder how far apart on substance we really are. When it comes to proponents for the treaty, I think something that we're still seeking is just more details around what it is they would like to see. The headline is clear, but those details are not, right. The actual the content of what it would include, and so we've done our best to put forth proactively what our vision for that new world is or could be. And I am hopeful we can continue to come together, over the next few weeks in advance of the special session. The way I might just
summarize that vision for us here.
Yeah, I was just going to say the way I might the way I might describe how we're coming at this is equity with urgency. So we know that, well, a few things have to happen. I mean, first off, we absolutely need to revisit the international health regulations, if not reopen them, right? And truly understand what went wrong and what adjustments must be made in the short term so that we get it right if ever this happens again. And that is doable. And it's and remains a posture for us just because we know we have an operating framework. There's also an acknowledgement that there's more than just the IHRs, right? There are sort of overarching governing models that need to be considered and debated, if not developed outright, let alone other pieces to this puzzle that are, for whatever reason, as we've seen, the harder issues, right? Like it's incredibly easy for folks to sort of wring their hands around the status quo and yet allow the gaps to somehow be sustained. And so we're coming at this and asking, okay, well, what does it look like for us to ensure that we are, sharing data, let alone innovations and truly meeting needs outside, the framework that exists already. And there's the reason why we're pushing for that, perhaps outside of, again, like this big sort of legally binding instrument, is because that takes so much time, and that's time we don't have, right, to answer these questions. So what happens until we take a decade to figure this out? And there's a real concern that it becomes this sort of flashy opportunity without that sense of urgency, right? Like what happens to that momentum? It runs the risk of doing, what I think you all have argued the summit could be, which we don't want to happen. So we want to be sure that there is just real clarity and immediacy to that process regardless. And again, we'll talk to our counterparts in other governments about what that could look like, especially if they're able to put forth those concrete ideas and we can come together around what happens today. Hopefully that helps.
Yeah, I mean, I think if this is all or nothing out of the special session, right, then we lose, right?
Yeah.
It all feels impossible. Not there's a lot we need to do, but countries have to agree. They have to reach agreement. So what are the things that are doable, that can move, that are not just the low-hanging fruit, but that actually are substantial, meaningful change, but without trying to have everything take a decade, right?
Yeah.
We're going to have another pandemic by then, or maybe more than one. And
I am sad to say that, yes, that might be true.
Situation, right? falling into back into that panic neglect cycle.
Yeah, no, we can't let that happen. And you guys can't let us let that happen, right? So
that is why we are here.
I'll just say that.
Absolutely. But so maybe that's actually the segue to my next question, which is, and again, I think there'll probably be more questions about, where can we land with this special session, but we are concerned about that political will already waning. I know you are. Coronavirus is no longer the world's top worry, according to recent data. The G20 was less than, G7 summit focused on the crisis, but then, kind of quickly moved beyond it. The G20 barely touched on it, and then the world just turned and focused on climate. Equally, also very important issue, but we surely our leaders have to be able to focus on more than one global challenge at a time. So, and just everybody already seems to want to put this in the rearview mirror. I was on a call with many of our friends this morning, folks who had been, and the leaders of both the independent panel and the G20 high level panel that were like, what are we going to do? How are we pushing on these different fronts to make sure something happens? And really concerned that already that political will and attention is fading, and that we're left with task forces and things that don't feel very urgent, as you say. So any thoughts for, this community about how we can, what more can we be doing to really sustain and drive that momentum and urgency, both on the current crisis and on the future? Where are we not managing to, why are we not managing to translate this into real action? Not that we've given up hope yet, and we're not going to do that, but it does feel like we're already losing the battle.
So I'm thinking about this question because I wonder, I guess we can look at that data from a couple different standpoints, right? I mean, we can think about decision makers, but then I also wonder how much of that is coming from the general public, and is there a real denial of this still being an issue, or is it more disappointment, right? That we actually haven't truly addressed the problem. That's even more tragic to me, that folks are maybe willing to accept that this is how it's going to be. We're going to be in this situation where, some countries have 60, 70% coverage and other countries are still in the single digits. We all know that's unacceptable, but to what degree are people beginning to accept that? That's a real problem right there. And I wonder if you dig more deeply into this data, whether that's what comes through, or at least those are the questions we ask, like what's truly driving it. And if so, what's making people want to give up on us, or on this effort that in these calls to action. Again, I hope that's not what's happening, and my heart sinks to say it. But if it is, it's better we know it now and truly try and drive that, or shift that thinking, that sense that, I don't know, that sense that we just settle into this crazy. It's crazy what we're still doing. It's crazy. We're still on screen. I have not seen you, many of you, in years. And whether it's in Geneva, which sounds very extravagant, or Washington, in New York, or, on the ground in these countries where we really should be, I refuse to accept that as my future. And I think that has to be the mantra. We refuse. And look at what our climate colleagues are doing. They refuse. And they are in the streets, and they are showing that they are not giving up on this effort, no matter how far off people want to make it seem. They're saying no. And, we need to, not we, you, others,
part of this,
we need to be in the streets.
It has to be a coalition of leaders in government, in multilateral institutions, but also in the private sector and in non-governmental institutions. Like, they have to be working in concert. And that's why we're so happy that we have people like you in these roles, but it is, there are still too few people. I mean, we've built this platform and, we've grown as a community, but largely it's because of the crisis in front of us, because it's affected the way we all work. I'm definitely afraid that, it's not too far off where people are going to go back to their day jobs and forget about this. And as you say, we refuse to let that happen, but I do think some good old fashioned outrage. I mean, we've done it around the vaccine and equity piece as a community, and things like the people's vaccine or whatever have like actually, helped to move the needle. We all have, but we need some good old fashioned outrage about all of this. And the fact that why should we tolerate either this as a continuing challenge, or that we're going to just face these threats and we just have to accept them. And like you said, the climate, it took a long time for the climate movement to get there, but it's there, and it now has a process, and it has the attention of heads of state and resources. Now, those advocates would argue, as they are right now in Glasgow, that it's not enough, and surely it's not enough. But I would like to be at that stage at least.
Well, I know when, once upon a time when I was there and not here, we talked about how to team up with, those constituents or communities, and not to capitalize on how far they've gone. I mean, maybe to some extent, if folks are being tactical, but really because there is, I'm a sucker for solidarity, and there's just so much to be said for coming together and locking arms and really understanding our connections. It's, you talk to anybody with lived experience, and they're never going to talk about just COVID, right? I mean, and even in this administration, we talk about the blend of these crises, unfortunately, and how they do truly affect individuals collectively, right? And so why not have one's advocacy or campaigns reflect those connections? It's hard, I know, because just as in government, there are these somewhat artificial, I would argue, lines between all these issues. But the more inclusive you become, I think that, the more momentum you all have been able to build, right? And that's whether you're looking across the health spectrum or looking around the world at, different geographies and communities coming in, even other stakeholders, as you mentioned, like the private sector, let alone the nonprofit community or civil society alongside governments. I mean, it's just their strength in numbers, that's just an organizing principle, organizing with the big O, right? So I would say keep at it and keep digging yourselves for who's still not here, who can push you/us farther.
Awesome advice. We have tons of questions.
I know, I see them flying in and I can't keep track.
I'm organizing these quickly, but I'm going to ask you one thing, just a little bit to follow up on what you just said, is what's the most surprising thing that has struck you coming and seeing the global health community from this vantage point, not as an advocate, but kind of on the inside, right? Both positively and negatively, about how it's acting as a community and around this crisis. And you're welcome to be provocative.
Because I'm never doing that. What is the most surprising thing that I have seen? Well, I have been surprised. I'm going to regret this. I know. I've been surprised.
We're all friends.
I know. Well, that's what I was going to speak to.
Yeah.
Y'all are nice. And I appreciate it because I have feelings. And also, I mean, we're all friends, right? And you have a job to do, just like I have a job to do. So if you got to turn it up, I think that's your job, right? But it's been pleasantly surprising that people want to be constructive, to be clear. And I think there's a way to, even express outrage and still, be outcomes oriented. But yeah, I come from the cancer space where survivors would show up everywhere all the time. and talk about their experiences, and we would hear them. Yeah, exactly. I see you, Paul. That was for you, buddy. um, but yeah, so that's I feel you all shifting. So just know that is, I mean, whether or not it's welcome, you do what you got to do. But we get it, and it's can help people in government too, right? To have external stakeholders really kind of lift up certain issues in certain ways. Yeah, that's probably what I've been most surprised about. I forget the other part of your question, but.
Well, it was really that surprising, but positively and negatively, just.
Oh, yeah. I don't know if there's well, I guess the hardest part of this for me, and some of you might have heard me say this before, is just, the sense of shared ambition, or the starting point for that ambition. Our administration is very clear about what we want to achieve. I think I took for granted perhaps where other governments are. And everyone is dealing with many things at once. And, this is my first time on this side. And so, there are many considerations within governments, many priorities, some politics, right? And so I can appreciate the sort of, I guess, deliberative or even conservative small C stance. But that's been surprising. I'm very much an idealist, and I've learned to just be more clear about the range or spectrum of ambition that people might have as a baseline.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to turn and see how many of the many questions we have we can work in here. And forgive me, everyone, I'm going to try to group these a little bit so that we can respond. But we've got a set of questions around funding and the pandemic treaty, a set of questions around kind of creating demand, around the US role, around zoonotic spillover, and I'm sure there are more at WGPR. So let me see how many of these we can get to, maybe starting with funding, my favorite topic. But it's a set of questions around, how do we get more support for funding? There's a particular set of questions here from Paul, Chris, others about Courtney, from preparedness, from Ashley, but also about but also on the response and on delivery and more support for like paying frontline healthcare workers. And I know there's been debate within the administration looking at the costs around delivery. Are they adequately costed out in the ACT Day numbers, for example? So maybe you can speak to that, but also speak to the ambition for preparedness funding. The US is the only country that's laid any money down on the table, and it's far too little, but at least it's a start. And we're pushing for more. And we also want to make sure that doesn't get lost from the push for additional resource mobilization around the summit targets. There's a question from Chris, like, how do we use the treaty process or whatever emerges from that to include commitments for increased financing? How do we ensure that funding for preparedness is not going to cannibalize other global health priorities? I know these are things you're thinking a lot about.
Yeah. Well, this is a hard one. I don't have all the answers, and I am interested in you all's take here too. I think in terms of, God, I don't like the word cannibalizing. It's the right one, but it's hard to think that, there's still this sense of either or here. As you all know, I have a role on the Global Fund Board on behalf of USG, and, it's really helpful. I know I can pick on them since Chris throughout this question, but it's really helpful when institutions or organizations are able to kind of blend the case. And so it doesn't present as, we got to either finish the fight in these areas or, prevent pandemics. But it's, really showing the overlap there is obviously really important, particularly as we're sort of passing the hat. I know that there was maybe some expressed concern too that by the US calling for or a fifth or financial intermediary fund, that we were walking away from other things. And I hope it's clear to this group it's not happening, right? We are still very much committed to organizations like the Global Fund, for example, and more broadly, the fight against HIV, for example. We're still very much committed to WHO and funding that mission and that work. And I mean, the money is there, right? Like that's the thing. And particularly when it comes to the fifth, we said it at the summit. I think we need to keep saying it. Our vision for that is to allow for not only ODA funding, but a mix of investments. And you had a philanthropist essentially match our initial contribution at the summit, and we need more of that. And I think we all collectively push for more of that, because people are going to space. We can fund it. It's like money is not the problem.
Exactly. My God. Every time I see that rocket ship go up, I'm like, really? There's another $1 billion that we could have spent on saving lives.
I just, I'm a Star Trek fan, so it's not that I'm against it necessarily, but I do believe that we can do both. I want to come back to this question of how we use other forums, and maybe, I'll answer it with regards to financing, and then I'll get into some other pieces. I think Arusha's here, and there's some stuff in the comment box too. I'm sorry people felt underwhelmed, I think was the word I saw around the G20. That was a hard process. I do have hope that this health finance task force, as it stands now, will be helpful in bringing two parties together that have not historically come together in a formal way. So I guess I just don't want that to be lost in the disappointment folks are feeling about it. Or frankly, I guess I shouldn't, I want to be open to hearing you all's real feedback about that task force. One of the reasons we are, hopeful about that is because we know like health ministers can't figure this out on their own, right? And again, when I was outside of government, I know a lot of folks would ask this question, well, how did health and finance ministers come together? And lo and behold, they really have been tracking and, working quite closely, even like here, Secretary Yellen talking to Secretary Becerra about these issues and working with their counterparts on this. It's no small feat, I think, to blend those conversations. And frankly, I think there's an opportunity to ensure that those discussions really are pragmatic and not so like kind of high-minded and just sort of saying what they wish to see, but actually looking specifically at challenges that need to be solved and how they can be addressed in the short or medium term. So that's how we leverage some forums like G20. The WHO process, it's interesting to think about what goes in there. And I'm glad you all were, tracking those discussions in the zero draft. There are a couple of ways to look at that. I mean, one is, yes, absolutely. Let's be sure we are mindful of the entire sort of ecosystem and larger global health problem when we're walking in the door. For us, certainly we're there to talk about pandemics, but we need to be mindful of these other systemic issues, right? Like health workforce and health financing, broadly speaking. That's certainly in our minds and hopefully what's seen as part of our recommendations. But we're also really clear, and maybe this gets to the question Kate asked, we're clear that WHO can't nor should it do everything. And so I think, one of the things we need to be sort of focused on as well as member states, as well as civil society, is what we're putting on WHO and what, we're sort of leaving to other parts of the global health ecosystem. Because it's just like it's too much to ask a health ministry to, take all of these things on it. It's arguably too much to ask an underfunded institution to do more with less. So, it's not to say they can't do more with more. I think those things can still be on the table. but there are a lot more stakeholders around the table now, and which means a lot more, heads and hands to help figure this out. And so the way we're walking into these discussions, or at least, and especially the way I'm approaching it with my team, is how we connect the dots across all of them, right? And ensure we're sort of, lifting all boats in that way, or all at least like applying the right pressure in the same direction so we make real progress.
Yeah, great. There was a specific question from Arish related to the zero draft, just about, do you have a sense moving forward that the US will, approach the issues around UHC, PHC, health system strengthening in a more concrete way and push for their inclusion, not just through the GPR, but through other health security initiatives? There's a lot, et cetera. So maybe just a word on that, about how you see there's so many different avenues, right, for change. And
for sure.
Of course, one concern is that we load too much onto one process, that it becomes everything and nothing. So
exactly,
obviously these are priorities for the administration, but and for this community. But what is the avenue? Pre-COVID, we had the UN high-level meeting on UHC, and that came out with a political declaration, but then that kind of stalled in the water in the face of the pandemic. So maybe if I can rework Arish's questions a little bit about how do you get back on track with that, while also making sure that these other tracks on a pandemic treaty and financing, et cetera, are moving forward.
Yeah, exactly. No, thanks for lifting this up. So the shortish answer is yes, as Carolyn said, these are priorities for us. And David and others are putting things in the chat about other initiatives we're tracking, right? And so we're not only looking to pile everything into the WGPR. I do think that would be detrimental, but rather we're really hoping to sort of, I guess, pepper the ecosystem with our various priorities, and certainly focused on workforce and kind of the broader UHC agenda as it relates to health emergencies, but not exclusive to health emergencies. So, I mean, remember, look, I hopefully don't just have this job for a year, right? Like we just got here. So I'm hoping that over the next year or two, you all will start to see some of these other pieces of our platform emerge in other areas. And so we leveraged the World Bank meeting. I guess that was just last month. Wow. We do have UHC Day coming up, which presents another opportunity, let alone, everything else next year. I hesitate to talk about us being on the other side of COVID because it's, something that will remain with us for a little bit longer. But we can and have been working towards these other goals simultaneously. So there's a little bit of stay tuned there, but hopefully some assurance that we have not lost sight of the full agenda, and certainly are thinking about how to sort of integrate that, not just in one place, but over time. Hopefully that helps, Arish.
I want to make sure we can get to as many of the other points or questions that were made. Back on vaccines and manufacturing, there was a comment earlier from Mitchell about what more we can do to increase equitable capacity and compel industry. You spoke earlier about getting more transparency around supply, but further thoughts on that. And then Jonah had talked about the, what are the, is the GPA an option in this to compel more sharing of mRNA technology? What more can we do on this front? So I know this is not all on your patch. It goes beyond, and there's a lot of players in this, but obviously you're in most of these conversations. So whatever you can speak to that.
Yeah, not all entirely in our lane, but the short of it is we get that there's more to it than just sharing vaccines, and even than just supporting a waiver. The tech transfer piece is a live conversation for us here. In addition to these other statements that we've made. I mean, we talked about voluntary tech transfer as part of our goals or aspirations even around the summit, and we meant it, right? There are, a number of pieces to that. It's been really helpful to have relationships with companies and frank conversations with companies about what we, meant by some of those objectives that we put out there. And it's been good to see, frankly, particularly when it comes to therapeutics, companies really starting from a different place. And I'd like to think that that's a result of what they've seen around vaccines and, what we collectively have expressed is, more of an expectation that we have around access. So that's our current thinking without getting into what can be confidential conversations with apologies. And I wasn't able to see the question, Carolyn, so I'm just tracking how you presented it. I'm sure I left some things out with apologies, but y'all just know, y'all can bug me and get a real answer out of me if you need to later.
Well, and we will capture these and share
Okay.
if anyone feels that we need to dive a little deeper. Actually, and I want to turn, there's some questions around zoonotic spillover, but actually just since we were on that thread on more on response, so a really a point from Jim asking, and I don't know if you can speak to this, but actually a two-parter on, if the calculations are right, the US has already put 15 billion into the global COVID response. Obviously, we think it can and should do more, but it doesn't, is there more the US can be doing to leverage that to lean on other countries? And there's probably a lot happening behind the scenes that we don't see. So, how is the US showing up in those conversations to others, but also we're hearing from our friends at USAID and elsewhere that we're running out of money from the ARP. So are there plans to seek another supplemental or additional appropriations? I would say not just for the COVID response, but again, for the three pillars across the summit, right? Keeping that unified view of the funding that's needed. And then, let me stop there because there's a couple of other different threads of questions.
Yeah, so yes, we are pushing countries to, to pony up in the same way. I think everyone could join us in doing so, and I'll leave it at that. With regards to Congress and appropriates, I mean, I think that's it's something that happens jointly as well, right? They certainly are aware of our needs, and they are seeing the same things we are in terms of, COVID not being completed in 2021. So hopeful that they, that the information we provided them has been helpful in making their decisions. Look, a lot of this is obviously in their hands. You all see what's been playing out in Washington and how hard it's been on the Hill for them, I think, to come to agreement around a range of issues. But the reality is this isn't going away for us, and the need is still so great. And the president certainly is committed to following through based on the framework or the goals we've put forth. So it's my hope that the resources will be available for that work because it's just so critical, not only for the U.S. to do it, but for the U.S. to play a pretty significant role as we have.
Yeah. We have just a few minutes left. I would be remiss. We've got questions and comments from Neil and Paul, among others, about climate change and pandemics and zoonotic spillover.
Yeah.
Neil, really pleased to see the linkage in President Biden's opening comments at the COP between non-infectious diseases and pandemics. But where does this go from here? Because we haven't seen that kind of high-level connection. What are the plans the administration has to really treat these as common solutions? And I would add, put the same kind of leadership on pandemics that it has on climate change, right? We don't have a national envoy for pandemics, presidential envoy. Can we see that same kind of leadership and all of government political will? I know not to dismiss the efforts that have been underway, but we don't see that same kind of sustained high level attention.
Mhm.
And then from Paul on, how the US and how you see things evolving on advocating for, the connections with zoonotic spillover, particularly in the context of a fifth, but also just in generally on the preparedness agenda. And I know HHS is doing some on this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that we were doing that already, right? So whether it was through GHSA or GHSI or NAPAPI, there are tons of acronyms around this stuff, whether we're talking about regional or global mechanisms. But the work we have been leading or coordinating at HHS with our counterparts on animal health, human health, and those intersections, like that doesn't go away, and that only has to ramp up, right? We probably have been too quiet about it, just because COVID has taken over and the general public, and some of those conversations haven't always gone back to those intersections. But absolutely something we're tracking, and would love to talk to people more about that. Relatedly, the AMR piece, antimicrobial resistance, remains on our agenda and radar. And again, we are looking at these kind of existing initiatives and asking now, well, how do we scale those or otherwise connect them to this momentum or attention we have around COVID? And in some ways we've been successful. In other ways, I think that's still an open question. There's some especially with the regional work, if not the bilateral work, I think we've done a good job sort of bringing the streams together. It can be harder at a global level just because of all the noise. I would be remiss though if I didn't lift up the big week we did have at COP. I didn't go to COP just because there's so much to do. But I sent several team members out to staff Admiral Levine, who's at HHS and our Assistant Secretary for Health. And she's been, kicking butt out there, talking about the connections between health and climate and doing it in different ways, right? But the US just announced a huge commitment to actually sort of address our footprint through our health industries. And it's been really helpful to see the New York Times, I think the last headline I saw, talk about that increasing connection between health and climate. Again, it's another part of where the bridge comes together. But I say let's use that, right, in the sort of for the One Health case too, and that could be something that we talk about with Admiral Levine, and we're increasingly bringing her into these global conversations as she settles into her role. And I think that her team and that the new HHS office on climate and health could be very interested in exploring that idea alongside, again, the ongoing work we've had in this space.
I'm going to throw in one last question because I think that's all time for. Well, one last question from the thing, and then I'll have you end it with something else. So from David and Vince, really a question about the Health Workforce Initiative from David. Where is that going? When can we see that really take off and be launched? And also just if anything else you might say a little bit more about what the why aren't we seeing why is there not more movement to really address the health workforce issue? So I guess those are kind of related, especially in light of the impact that COVID has had on health workforce. I'm sorry, Vince, I haven't done that quite justice, but just quickly on that, and maybe before we leave, just what are you hopeful about looking ahead to the new year? I mean, we've got these moments, right, that each moment sort of hopefully moves the needle a bit, but where do you think we can really get some serious traction? What keeps you hopeful about 2022 that we can all be pushing toward?
Yeah. Okay. So on workforce, I hate that it feels slow to y'all. I'm like, I have been up since 3 a.m. So, and that's not the only day this week. So, I think we
it's always easy to
yeah, we need more bodies in here, certainly. So it's happening. I promise you. I feel it's safe saying I promise you, David, that it it's happening. And message received that we need to bring that bell a bit louder for people like you and Vince and others who have been doing that for us on the outside. I think it also is the case that some of these conversations happen elsewhere. So like I just did a session with people like Anders Nordstrom and Precious Masotso and folks who we were talking about value-based care. And I talked all about health workforce, in that session and the importance of us rooting our work in workforce. HHS has done that domestically in a way that translates globally as well. Again, like, I don't know if everyone on the screen tends to be in those conversations, but that's where we're making investments, right? Mm-hmm. So people get it. Yeah, and communications. No, you're right. I do not have a communication staff person, just BT dubs.
That was not a personal, it's
it's okay.
Government-wide issue.
It's okay. Yes, and it is. It's not our strong suit in here. So yeah, that's in train. But let's, just stay synced up to, again, be sure you're keeping us honest that that's rolling out in a way that feels right. I know the White House has consulted a number of folks, including people here, about its ambitions or aspirations. And I'm hopeful that, what comes out or across will reflect, what the input that people have provided. So thank you to those of you who even answered my calls and said, when I said, hey, I want to be sure that, we're listening to people on the ground who live and breathe this. It's been very helpful. What I'm hopeful about, I am, I'm still hopeful. I am. I'm hopeful that we will continue listening to people who, are living and breathing the work, right? And let alone experiencing this crisis firsthand. And I'm actually hopeful that we will see and feel the outrage. I mean, it was already breaking through over the summer around vaccine inequity, as you said, Carolyn. And I hear people also echoing some of those cries around therapeutics. Let's be clear, they shouldn't have to, right? I think that's the tragedy here as well. But those voices, they are felt and they are heard. And, the louder they are, right, the more we can't ignore them. And so I'm hopeful about that. And then I'm hopeful that, sooner rather than later, people will be able to stop screaming, because we should just start listening and start acting. And I'd like to think that's part of what we're doing. We will do more of that and hope that others who can will do more of that with us. But that's my goal and that's my hope for the not too distant future. So thank y'all very much for letting me come crash your party and see old friends.
Anytime. This is a big if everyone wants to just turn off their mics and just say a big thank you to
Loyce. That's really sweet, y'all.
We know how busy you are, but we're so happy that you're there fighting for us. And that we also know we can talk frankly to us, and you're going to talk frankly back to us and tell us what's what and where we need to push, but we're also going to tell you where you need to push. And
exactly.
That's where we're going to make progress. So everybody give a warm welcome to Loyce. Thank you for making the time, and everybody have an awesome day.
Thank you.
Bye. Strong and get some sleep.
Yes, exactly. I do have to sleep.
Call me at any time.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Thank you so much for spending the morning with us. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Bye. Thanks, Loyce. You rock.
Thanks, Karen.